Imagine a single battle, one decision, one desperate charge across an open field, and suddenly the future of an entire nation changes forever. More than 850,000 people would die, cities would burn, families would be torn apart, and America would never be the same again. But here is the shocking part. Most people think the American Civil War was decided by just one famous battle. They are wrong. The war was actually decided by a chain of battles. Some lasted only a few hours, others dragged on for weeks. Each one pushed the nation closer to survival or absolute destruction. A single victory could save a country. Single mistake could destroy it. Tonight, we are not just
telling the story of a war.
We are uncovering the 7 battles that changed the fate of America forever. Moments filled with courage, fear, blood, and decisions that still shape our world today. And the first battle began with a dangerous illusion. The illusion that this war would be easy. It wouldn't. Not even close. In the summer of 1861, America was at war. But almost nobody understood what that really meant. Politicians believed it would be over in weeks. Newspapers promised quick, glorious victories. Young men rushed to enlist, certain they would return home as heroes before the year ended. The North had more factories, more railroads, and more people. Many believed the Confederacy stood no chance. All that remained was one decisive blow. And so on July 21, 1861, thousands of raw Union soldiers marched toward a small Virginia stream known as Bull Run. Their objective was simple: defeat the Confederate Army, capture Richmond, and end the war. What happened next shattered those expectations forever. As the armies moved into position, something extraordinary occurred. Citizens from Washington traveled down to watch the battle. Some arrived in horse-drawn carriages. Others brought picnic baskets. Families gathered on nearby hills, believing they were about to witness a brief military spectacle, almost like entertainment. They had no idea they were watching the opening act of America's bloodiest conflict. At first, everything seemed to go according to plan. Union forces attacked aggressively, and Confederate troops began falling back. Reports spread that victory was near. Then, suddenly, the battlefield shifted. Reinforcements arrived, rushing fresh Confederate troops into the fight. At the center of the chaos stood a little-known commander named Thomas Jackson. His men refused to retreat, holding their position despite overwhelming pressure. Seeing this, another Confederate officer reportedly pointed toward him and shouted, "Look, there stands Jackson like a stone wall." From that moment on, he became known as Stonewall Jackson, a name that would echo throughout the war. The fighting intensified. Smoke covered the fields, cannons thundered without pause, and commands became impossible to hear. Units lost contact with one another. What began as an organized battle slowly dissolved into pure chaos. Then came the collapse. The Union lines broke. Soldiers began running. Officers tried desperately to restore order, but fear spreads faster than commands. Soon the retreat became a full-blown panic. Roads choked with fleeing troops, wagons overturned, and horses bolted. The civilians who had come to enjoy the day suddenly found themselves trapped among thousands of terrified, retreating soldiers. The picnic had become a nightmare. By nightfall, the Union Army was racing back toward Washington. The Confederates had won. But victory came at a terrible cost. Nearly 5,000 men were killed, wounded, captured, or missing. For the first time, Americans understood the brutal truth. This would not be a short war. This would not be a glorious adventure. The illusion was dead. The nation now faced a conflict far larger and far more violent than anyone had ever imagined. The South had won the first major battle of the war, and Southern confidence was soaring. But while newspapers celebrated, a quiet officer in the West was preparing to change everything. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. At the time, few Americans knew who he was. He wasn't famous, he wasn't politically connected, and he certainly wasn't considered a military genius. In fact, many viewed him as a failure. Before the war, Grant had struggled in business and had resigned from the Army years earlier. Some even questioned whether he belonged in command at all. But war has a strange way of revealing a man's true character. Soon, the entire nation would learn his name. By February 1862, the Confederacy controlled 2 powerful strongholds, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Together, they protected Tennessee and blocked Union access to key rivers. As long as those forts stood, the South controlled the gateway to its interior. Grant understood something many traditional commanders not. Winning this war wasn't just about defeating armies. It was about controlling movement, supplies, transportation, and rivers. Fort Donelson was the key. The Union attack began. Gunboats pounded Confederate defenses, and cannons shook the frozen landscape. For days, both sides fought in brutal winter conditions. Snow fell, temperatures plummeted, and men froze in their camps. Some soldiers woke up to find their comrades dead beside them, not from bullets but from the biting cold. Yet the battle raged on. Then came the twist. Confederate commanders launched a massive counterattack, punching a hole through the Union lines. For a moment, victory was within their reach. An escape route had opened. The Confederate army could have retreated and saved themselves. Instead, their commanders hesitated. Rather than escaping, they pulled their men back into the fort. It was one of the most costly blunders of the war, and Grant saw the opportunity instantly. "Some of our men are pretty badly demoralized," an officer warned him. Grant looked across the snow-covered battlefield and calmly replied, "The enemy is more demoralized than we are." He ordered an immediate assault. Union troops surged forward, breaking the Confederate line, and suddenly the defenders found themselves completely trapped. There was nowhere left to run. Inside Fort Donelson, the Confederate leadership faced reality. The battle was lost. Two top generals fled into the night, abandoning thousands of their own soldiers. By morning, the remaining commander had no choice but to ask Grant for terms of surrender. Perhaps he expected a standard military negotiation or a polite compromise. Instead, Grant sent back a cold, definitive response that would make him legendary. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. The message stunned the South. There would be no bargaining, no special treatment, only total surrender. When the news hit northern newspapers, the public went wild. Grant's initials were U.S., and reporters quickly dubbed him Unconditional Surrender Grant. The nickname stuck. With the fall of Fort Donelson, more than 13,000 Confederate soldiers became prisoners, one of the largest surrenders in American history up to that point. Tennessee now lay exposed. Critical rivers were in Union hands, and for the first time, the North began to believe they could actually win.
A new leader had emerged, a commander who refused to stop attacking, a man who knew that hesitation loses wars. But his bloodiest days were still ahead. By the autumn of 1862, the war had already claimed tens of thousands of lives. Yet neither side had delivered a decisive blow. At the center of Southern hope stood General Robert E. Lee. After a string of stunning victories in Virginia, Lee made a daring gamble. He would bring the war into Northern territory. If successful, an invasion of Maryland could force the Union to negotiate for peace, and it might finally convince European powers to recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. Everything depended on this one campaign. In September 1862, Lee's army crossed the Potomac River. Northern civilians watched in shock. The enemy was no longer far away. The war had arrived at their doorstep. Then an unbelievable stroke of luck occurred. A Union soldier discovered a lost Confederate document wrapped around a few cigars. It was Lee's exact battle plan. Every movement, every division, every objective. The Union suddenly held the greatest intelligence discovery in military history. Yet, even with the blueprint to Lee's army, victory was far from guaranteed. At dawn on September 17th, near the small town of Sharpsburg, the two massive armies collided. The battle began in a sprawling cornfield. Within minutes, the tall rows of corn became a literal killing ground. Musket fire tore through the stalks, cannons blasted gaping holes through entire formations, and men vanished into the thick, choking smoke. When the firing finally stopped, thousands lay dead or wounded among the shattered stalks. One witness later recalled, "Every stalk of corn in the northern part of the field was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife." And the day was just getting started. By mid-morning, the fighting shifted toward a narrow, sunken dirt path, a simple farm lane. Before the sun went down, it would become infamous. Wave after wave of Union soldiers charged, while Confederates fired from the natural trench of the sunken road. Bodies piled upon bodies until the ditch literally filled with blood. History would rename that road Bloody Lane. By afternoon, the chaos moved toward a stone bridge crossing Antietam Creek. Union forces desperately needed to cross. Confederate forces fought to the death to hold it. For hours, the bridge was a bottleneck of slaughter. Charge after charge was repelled, but finally, at enormous cost, Union troops broke through. The Confederate line began to fracture. For a brief moment, it looked like Lee's entire army might be utterly destroyed. Then came the final twist of the day. Confederate reinforcements arrived at the 11th hour, rushing directly from the road into the fight. The Union advance stalled, the intensity faded, and by nightfall, the fire stopped. Neither side had achieved a clean victory. But the ground between them told the true story of the day. When the casualties were counted, America stood in absolute shock. More than 22,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. In a single day, no single day in American history, before or since, has seen more casualties. Antietam remains the bloodiest for Americans have ever experienced. Technically, the battle was a draw, but strategically it was a massive success for the North. Lee's invasion had been halted, and his army retreated back into Virginia. This gave President Abraham Lincoln the political leverage he had been waiting for. Just days later, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The war was no longer just about preserving a government. It was now a crusade against slavery. The moral landscape of the war had changed forever. While the headlines focused on the bloody clashes in the East, a slow, brutal struggle was unfolding hundreds of miles away in the West. A struggle that would determine whether the Confederacy could even survive. At the heart of it was Vicksburg, Mississippi, a city so critical that Confederate President Jefferson Davis called it the nailhead that holds the South's two halves together. Perched high on steep cliffs overlooking a sharp bend in the Mississippi River, Vicksburg was a natural fortress. Heavy artillery bristled from its ridges, threatening any Union ironclad that dared to pass. As long as Vicksburg stood, the South held the Mississippi, allowing weapons, men, and food from the western states of Texas and Arkansas to feed the Confederate armies in the East. Lose Vicksburg, and the Confederacy would be sliced clean in half. Ulysses S. Grant knew this better than anyone, but taking it seemed impossible. Previous Union generals had tried and failed miserably. For months, Grant tried one plan after another, digging canals, exploring bayous, throwing his men into frontal assaults. Every attempt failed. Critics mocked him. Newspapers labeled him a failure, and politicians demanded Lincoln fire him. But Grant refused to retreat, because he knew the war could not be won without Vicksburg. Then, he launched his boldest gamble. Abandoning his supply lines, Grant marched his army south on the opposite side of the river, crossed into enemy territory, and looped around to attack Vicksburg from behind. It was a terrifyingly risky maneuver. If he failed, his army would be cut off and annihilated. But Grant wasn't playing for safety. He was playing to win. In May 1863, his forces struck with lightning speed. One Confederate position after another collapsed, and the defenders were forced back into their trenches. Grant had done the impossible. He had surrounded the fortress. Now, he would starve them out. Days bled into weeks. Union artillery pounded the city relentlessly from land, while gunboats bombarded it from the river. Explosions echoed day and night. Inside Vicksburg, conditions degenerated into absolute horror. Food vanished. Families fled their homes and dug caves into the hillsides to survive the constant shelling. Children slept underground. Soon the citizens were eating horses, then mules, and eventually, even rats became a luxury. Hunger was a far deadlier enemy than the Union Army. Grant waited patiently, knowing that time was his greatest ally. On July 4, 1863, after 47 days of agonizing siege, Confederate General John Pemberton raised the white flags of surrender. Nearly 30,000 Confederate soldiers laid down their arms. With Vicksburg's fall, the Union gained total control of the Mississippi River. The Confederacy was officially split in two. Supplies and reinforcements from the West were cut off for good. The South had suffered a wound from which it would never recover. But what made the timing of Vicksburg truly extraordinary was what was happening simultaneously, 1,000 miles away in the hills of Pennsylvania.
In July 1863, General Robert E. Lee launched his second and final invasion of the North. The Confederacy was running low on food, low on equipment, and low on time. They could not win a war of attrition. Lee believed a crushing victory on Northern soil would destroy the Union's political will to fight and finally force Great Britain and France to intervene. The stakes had never been higher. As Lee's battle-hardened army marched into Pennsylvania, a new and untested Union commander, General George Meade, was suddenly thrust into command. He had only a few days to organize his forces before facing the most dangerous army in the world. On July 1st, the two sides collided near a small crossroads town called Gettysburg. Ironically, the battle began almost by accident. As Confederate soldiers entered the town looking for supplies, specifically shoes. Instead of shoes, they ran into Union cavalry. A skirmish erupted, reinforcements poured in from both sides, and before anyone realized it, a massive three-day battle had begun. The first day belonged to Lee. Union forces were battered and pushed back through the streets of Gettysburg, eventually retreating to the high ground south of town, a hook-shaped line of hills that included Cemetery Ridge and a rocky hill called Little Round Top. On July 2nd, Lee slammed into the Union flanks. The fighting was savage and primal. At Little Round Top, a young Union colonel named Joshua Chamberlain found his regiment out of ammunition, holding the critical edge of the entire Union line. The Confederates were charging up the hill again, and there was no time to reload. Chamberlain made a desperate choice that would enter military lore. He drew his sword and shouted, "Bayonets!" The Union soldiers fixed their blades and charged directly down the hill into the shocked Confederates. The flank was saved, the line held, and the Union survived into Day 3. July 3rd was the climax. Believing the Union center was weak after 2 days of flank attacks, Lee ordered his most controversial assault, a massive direct charge across a mile of wide-open fields. Nearly 13,000 Confederate soldiers stepped out of the woods, forming a line that stretched for blocks. Their objective was to march through direct artillery fire and smash the center of the Union wall. The assault became known as Pickett's Charge. As they marched, Union cannons opened up, tearing massive holes in the Confederate ranks. Men fell by the hundreds, yet the line closed up and kept walking. Closer and closer. For a few brief, chaotic moments, a fraction of the Confederate force actually reached the stone wall. Hand-to-hand combat erupted, and Southern flags planted themselves on the ridge. The fate of the nation hung in the absolute balance, but the center held. Union reinforcements flooded the breach, and the Confederate charge collapsed. The survivors turned and walked back across the field of slaughter, leaving thousands of their brothers behind. Lee rode out to meet his broken men, devastated, and whispered, "It is all my fault." Gettysburg was a catastrophe. More than 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing over those 3 days, making it the deadliest battle ever fought on the North American continent. Lee's army retreated south, limping back to Virginia. The Confederacy would never invade the North again. The tide had officially turned. By 1864, the war was dragging into its fourth agonizing year. Hundreds of thousands were dead, and across the North, a dangerous fatigue was setting in. People were tired of the body counts. President Abraham Lincoln was facing a massive political crisis. Support for the war was evaporating, and polls suggested he was on track to lose the upcoming presidential election to George McClellan, a candidate who promised to end the war through negotiations with the South. If Lincoln lost, the Confederacy would survive, and the Union would split forever. Everything now depended on a massive, undeniable victory before citizens went to the polls. That victory would be decided in Atlanta, Georgia, the industrial heart of the Deep South. Atlanta was a crucial hub of railroads, factories, and supply lines that fed the Confederate war machine. To capture it, Lincoln turned to General William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman was a ruthless realism. He understood that modern wars weren't just won by defeating soldiers on a battlefield. They were won by destroying the enemy's infrastructure and their will to fight. In May 1864, Sherman began his push toward the city with 100,000 men. For months, Sherman played a giant game of chess with Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, constantly outflanking him and forcing him back toward Atlanta's defenses. But Southern leaders grew impatient with Johnston's defensive retreats. They wanted aggressive action, so they replaced him with General John Bell Hood, a young, notoriously fearless commander. Hood gave them the aggression they wanted, launching a series of massive, violent counterattacks around the city. The results were catastrophic for the South. Wave after wave of Confederate soldiers broke against Sherman's defensive lines on July 22, 1864. The formal Battle of Atlanta reached its bloody peak. The fighting was desperate, but by sunset, Hood's forces had failed again, suffering devastating losses they could not replace. By August, Sherman had completely severed the railroads into Atlanta. Cut off from food and ammunition, Hood's army could no longer hold the city. On the night of September 1st, explosions rocked the sky as retreating Confederate forces blew up their own ammunition trains to keep them out of Union hands. Great fireballs lit up the Georgia night. Atlanta was abandoned. The next morning, Union troops marched into the city. The news of Atlanta's fall spread across the North like wildfire, and overnight the political landscape transformed. Northern morale skyrocketed. The doubts vanished. And Lincoln's path to re-election was secured. Historians agree. Without the fall of Atlanta, Lincoln likely would have lost the election of 1864, and the map of America today would look completely different. But Sherman was far from done. By the dawn of 1865, the Confederacy was starved of resources, bleeding out slowly like a fire running out of fuel. The victories at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Atlanta had systematically dismantled the South's capacity to resist. Now, the endgame had arrived. After burning the military infrastructure of Atlanta, Sherman launched his infamous March to the Sea, cutting a 60-mile-wide path of destruction across Georgia all the way to Savannah. He tore up railroads, burned factories, and proved to the Southern population that their government could no longer protect them. The psychological blow was absolute. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Ulysses S. Grant had locked Robert E. Lee's starving army of Northern Virginia into a deadly chokehold. Grant understood a cold math. The South could no longer replace its dead, while the North could. In April 1865, the Confederate capital of Richmond finally fell. Abandoned by its government and left burning in the night, Lee knew the end had come. His men were exhausted, surrounded, and literally starving, surviving on parched corn and raw courage. On April 9, 1865, in the quiet village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, the two greatest commanders of the war met face to face inside a simple brick home. There were no cheering crowds, no dramatic speeches, and no bitter recriminations. Just two tired generals ending a terrible 4-year nightmare. Grant offered terms, allowing the Southern soldiers to keep their horses and return home to their families. Lee accepted. The primary army of the Confederacy surrendered, and for all practical purposes, the Civil War was over. America paid a horrific price for its survival. More than 700,000 lives lost, an entire generation vanished. And scars that run deep through American society even to this day, but the Union survived. Slavery was permanently abolished, and the nation began the long, painful walk toward healing. The Civil War was never just about a single moment. It was about a chain of moments, a third digits made by regular people under unimaginable pressure. From the tragic illusion of Bull Run to the quiet surrender at Appomattox. Every link in that chain shaped the world we live in today. More than 160 years later, the echoes of those choices still linger, reminding us just how fragile a nation can be, and how much it costs to hold one together.